Hey guys, it's Jan for Chess24. In this video, we will look at another game from the Tata Steel Masters in Wijk aan Zee. This is a game between Wojtaszek with the white pieces and Fabiano Caruana, the world number 2, with the black pieces. If you haven't heard of Mr. Wojtaszek, he is the Polish number 2. He's an outstanding theoretician, has been a member of Vichy Anand's team during, I believe, 3 World Championship matches, and has also himself as a player contributed so many very interesting ideas. He's also a world-class player in his own right. His rating has recently fallen a bit to around 27. So yeah, what is it? 2705. You would expect him more on the 2730, 40 neighborhood. And he is having a mediocre tournament, I think, 3.5 out of 8 going into this game. He's facing Fabiano Caruana, the world number 2. The vice world champion, I believe that's his title. And obviously one of the best. There is the defending champion in this Tata Steel tournament. Fabiano going into this game is half a point behind the leader, Alireza Firouzja. So he will be looking for chances with the black pieces, and his opening choice shows exactly that. Wojtaszek starts with c4 the English, but Caruana says, you know what, I don't care what move order you choose, I will play the King's Indian. Maybe the most combative opening there is. Black gives up all the central control and is saying, I will counterattack against your center, and ideally your king later on. Bishop e2, the main line, pawn to e5, short castles. So far all of this has been seen many a time. The absolute main move in this position is the move knight to c6. But turns out that Mr. Caruana has different intentions. He goes for bishop to g4, a very rare continuation, which puts pressure on the d4 pawn in a different way. This bishop targets the knight, and maybe it can undermine this pawn, but it is still a move that's not seen very often. Wojtaszek chooses bishop to e3, defending this pawn on d4. Let's do a very brief survey of the other options, just for theory nerds out there. One principled option would be to take the pawn on e5, after which black, I believe, has 2 choices. He could capture on f3. If the bishop recaptured, then black would be fine. Here the 2 bishops don't matter so much with his hole on d4. But white could take on f6, and after bunch of exchanges, this position I would assume is somewhat better for white, with his knight controlling this square. So I could imagine that after d takes e, Caruana didn't have bishop takes f3 in mind, but just wanted to recapture a pawn sacrifice. But here it looks to me like black gets decent compensation. Knight takes e5, queen takes d1. White has to recapture with the bishop, because if not, he loses control over this construction. And now just bishop e6, keeping piece on the board with sort of typical compensation for the pawn. I believe if you continue analyzing here, black should be okay. Instead, after bishop g4, another principled way to deal with the tension would be pawn to d5. I have a feeling this is the most principled and maybe the best move, but it's also not a move that many players like. You give up the tension in the center, you commit to this closed, fixed, maneuvering King's Indian structure where you know that eventually black will probably create some counter chances. So I fully understand Wojtaszek doesn't go for it. I believe it's probably the critical continuation, although the position is by no means clear after something like, I don't know, something like this. This type of position with pawn to f5, bishop to h6. The battle is just beginning. Wojtaszek chooses to keep tension, bishop e3, and asks Caruana to reveal his hand. If Caruana does so, the idea is very direct and somewhat surprising. He gives up the bishop voluntarily. Bishop takes f3, and please keep the theme of giving bishops up voluntarily in mind. Bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, and now he takes on d4. Trying to gain some time developing after bishop takes d4, knight to c6. There was another option to play knight c6 directly, but after pawn to d5, The sort of typical pawn sacrifice knight d4 I don't think is all that impressive. White would just take rook e8, put the queen somewhere, be a pawn up. Black has some play on the dark squares, but I'd pick white. While if you don't take and play knight to e7, or if you don't go knight d4, sorry, and play knight to e7, then you will really miss your light square bishop in the ensuing play. White is just much better here, pawn to c5. White would have a head start, so knight c6. Not a great idea. Instead, Caruana shows his intention. E takes d, bishop takes d4, and now knight c6. Forcing this bishop to move again, because this dark square bishop is a key piece, and you don't want to trade it. Bishop to e3, to e8, queen to d2, knight d7. And both sides have completed more or less the first stage, and we can take a moment to take stock of what's happened. So black is missing the two bishops. He has a bishop and a knight versus the white bishop pair. That's a long-term advantage for white. But the advantage black has is that this bishop on f3 is very clumsy at the moment. It would like to have some secure square like g3, bishop g2, but that takes time. And standing on f3, it not only blocks the f-pawn from covering the e4 square, it also blocks activity in form of f4. Can be a target for the knight and sometimes the queen. So this bishop on f3 is white's problem, and of course maintaining his pawn center. One big plus white has in this position is not just the two bishops, but also that he can put his knight on d5, from where it would be pretty dominant generally, covering all kinds of critical squares, and combined with bishop g5 it would be ready to ask some questions. The problem concretely is that if white goes knight d5, black goes knight c5, counterattacks against the e4 pawn, and it's not easy to maintain this construction once again, because it's awkward to defend that pawn. As for black, he would generally like to occupy the d4 square. In an ideal world, he would remain with a knight on d4 that's supported by a pawn against just a light square bishop, and exchange pieces accordingly, but that's easier said than done. So Wojtaszek plays rook a1, naturally enough move, and the reason I chose this game really is Caruana's next move, which to me is more shocking than many attacking combinations, sacrifices, brilliancies I've seen. Because to see such a move and it being good from a world-class player is just nothing we are used to if you grew up reading old chess books and so on. You know, this bishop is holy in all these structures. You never give up your fianchetto bishop unless you win material or you weaken the white structure significantly. And what does Caruana do here? He goes bishop takes c3, exchanges his bishop for the knight, and allows white to recapture with the queen, keeping the white structure intact. And still a good move. It is shocking, and it's also one of these don't try this at home. In most cases, bishop takes c3 is still wrong, but Caruana, and I would assume his engines, because bishop takes c3 is the first choice of modern engines, which is pretty shocking in itself, have correctly evaluated that in this particular scenario, with his bishop being slightly clumsy on f3, black can do this and then justify it move by move using the targets on e4 and c4 and this bishop here. It is a very deep idea. It's beautiful and shocking, to me at least. But it very much depends on the concrete follow-up. So don't try this at home. Queen to f6 played. This is the first idea. Black can challenge for this vital long diagonal. And white cannot exchange, because usually white wouldn't mind exchanging queens here. But after takes, there is no way to defend this pawn on e4. Even this position, I'm not sure if white is worse, but it's certainly not playing for an edge, giving up this pawn, because you cannot keep it. So Wojtaszek has to move his queen away. He chooses a subtle maneuver. He goes for queen c1. Engines want to see queen d2, once again, not being shy to sacrifice this pawn, but with queens on the board. Something like knight c5, pawn to b4. Knight takes e4 and queen c2, with good play for white. So after queen d2, my engine goes even more subtle and goes queen c6 first, targeting this pawn, preparing knight c5 maybe. When, yeah, the black construction seems viable, but it's not like black better here or anything. It's just you would expect him to be much worse after bishop takes c3, and he's not. Queen c2 was another interesting move. Could lead to similar positions like in the game after knight c5. So queen c1 is the move played. Knight to c5, targeting this guy. I should mention, in all these knight c5 situations, it's never a great idea for white to capture this knight, because after dc5, black gets exactly what he wants. Gets this good knight against bad bishop. The knight will come to d4, rule the board. And yeah, black is just much, much better. So you can never take this. Wojtaszek goes for queen to b1, keeping an eye on the e4 pawn and also threatening b4. But Caruana insists on asking questions. Queen e6, double attack against e4 and c4. And once again, white can't keep his pawns without giving up this bishop, which you don't want to do. Wojtaszek decides to part with the c4 pawn, but maybe it was better to keep the c4 pawn and give up this e4 pawn, which is standing in the way of the poor bishop anyway. After b4, knight takes e4, rook c1, just covering c4 and c3. Seems like white is still doing all right. He's down a pawn, but with his bishops being active, and the black king long-term being somewhat vulnerable. It seems the position is roughly equal, at least if we can trust the engine. So Wojtaszek goes rook fe1, and Caruana takes the pawn. Queen takes c4. This position is still far from clear, although black won a pawn, because white now embarks on the mission to bring this bishop to the long diagonal, which of course has been weakened by the exchange of Mr. g7. However, Caruana rightly evaluates that he has enough pieces in this critical area to defend his king, and he plays move h5, which to me is always a tough move to make. I always find it instructive when top players do it, but I'm never sure when it's a good idea, when it's not. Here h5, h4, followed by g5. Seems like an excellent way to improve the position. You could make other moves as well, but I think this is a smart concept. Bishop b2. Of course, this diagonal has to be blocked. Knight to e5. Now it's very important that white doesn't get a chance to play f4, but for now he's not close to it. Bishop e2, pawn to h4, also typical. This march of the pawns, h3 is a bit of a nuisance, making it harder for white to expand here in a normal way as well. So this is good stuff. Queen to c1, pawn to g5, stopping f4 once again, which was the threat. Bishop to b5. This seems to be a step in the wrong direction. It's not like Wojtaszek was hoping Caruana would miss the attack. He wants to provoke pawn to c6, or after rook e7 is played in the game, he wants to free this e3 square for his rook, so that the rook can get a little activated. But it costs time, and the bishop is not doing anything on b5. So the computer's recommendation was to be preferred to go pawn to b4, knight to e6, and bishop to g4, activating this bishop in this direction. And with these two pins and the pressure against the c7 pawn, it looks like white would still be very much in business. After b4, it's important to mention that knight takes e4, f3 doesn't work because this knight gets trapped in the middle of the board. So instead bishop b5 was played, but now black is in time to put all his pieces on nice squares. Rook e7, queen g6, bishop has to go back because there's nothing to do there, and rook a8. Black's setup is more or less complete. Last order of business is bring this this knight over here and then start an attack. And this is what happens, kids. Queen c2, knight e6. Here, white's position already looks unpleasant to play to me. The computer still says no reason to panic. Play pawn to h3, try to maintain the structure and keep this bishop active, but it does look unpleasant for white already. Instead, after knight e6, Wojtaszek plays pawn to f3, trying to stabilize here, trying to cover this pawn, but it also robs his bishop of his squares to go to, blocks in his own rook, and it gives black a hook. So pawn to f3 is probably making black's task somewhat easier. Knight to f4, bishop to f1, and Caruana decides it's not the time to try to open the position yet, finds another very strong move, c6, intending d5 in the right circumstances, opening the e-file for his rooks, which are just patiently waiting to join the fight. Queen f2, rook e6, keeping an eye on d6 first, rook c3, attacking the pawn on a7, But that does not stop Mr. Caruana. He goes d5 anyway. Says, you want this pawn? Be my guest. I will then open the position here. Pawn to h3 or pawn to g4 are crushing. The queen is just way too far away. E takes d5 was possible, but then after knight takes d5, black achieved what he wanted, opening the e-file for his rooks. And it's another tricky topic. When do you open the position for what? Because we're also taught against the two bishops, you should try to keep the position close. The answer is, as usual, it depends. And under these circumstances, the knights are well centralized, keeping the bishops more or less at bay. The rooks have the open file. So black is better here after pawn to h3, also because the white king is somewhat vulnerable. But that's what makes chess so difficult. It's always weighing different factors. Wojtaszek doesn't want e takes d5. He wants to chase this knight away by pawn to g3. But in trying to do that, he weakens his own king further. And this will backfire. H takes g, h takes g. Caruana does not go for the computer kill here. He could have played pawn to g4, which according to Mr. Comp is just winning. G takes f, knight takes f3, king g2, queen takes e4. And apparently the white construction just collapses. For example, rook f3, trying to get rid of this. G takes f, queen takes f3, queen c2 check. And something's gonna fall. Instead, Caruana plays d takes e4, also a piece sacrifice. And also pretty strong. The reason it's less strong than g4 is that according to the computer, white could still hang in here with f takes e4 when there's no direct win for black. But after f takes e4, knight h5 back, black still remains very much in the driver's seat with e4 being weak, g3 being weak, white king being weak. But this was the best chance. Instead, Wojtaszek says, you know what, I don't want to suffer forever. Give me that horsey and we'll see how it goes. But Caruana has it all figured out. After g takes f4, g takes f4 check. Turns out there's no defense for white, which is somewhat surprising. White is a piece up and it's not like it's direct checkmate or anything, but the tactics just work. If you want to do some tactics, you can try to figure out what happens after king h1. I found this a very pretty maneuver. So pause the video and try to figure it out. There's probably more than one solution, but the one I was fishing for is queen h7 check. This is very pretty, clearing the 6th rank for the rook. And after king g1, now queen g7 check. Very instructive again. If the king sidesteps, then rook h6, now that the rook can operate here, will win the house. And if queen g2, rook g6, once again using the 6th rank. It's curtains. Bishop g2, ef is not much better either. So queen to g2 played, e takes f3. This is the real star move of the combination. Not so much the move itself, but that Caruana has figured out that even after the queen exchange, his initiative will break through. He once again proves that he's one of the, if not the best calculator in the business. Rook g6 check. It doesn't really look like white should be that lost, does it? But he is. King f2 looks logical, trying to run away. But here, rook g3, this was the move. Caruana to see in advance. Just pretty much ends the game because knight g4 is a checkmate threat. This is just checkmate. Therefore, in order to parry that, I will have to run away with the king, but that costs him a lot of material, let's say. Check, takes. Game over. So the king cannot go to f2, has to go to the h-file. But first of all, it's always in danger of getting mated here. Let's imagine rook check. Secondly, now it no longer controls this square. And this pretty much overloads the white defenses. There's just not much to hope for here. f3, rook h6 is there, rook h1, rook g1, knight g4, knight going anywhere, rook e1. It's just too much. Wojtaszek tries bishop h3. If he tried bishop e2, then f3 ends the game. Takes, and rook e1 check. So there's just no defense, and after bishop h3, Caruana comes up with one last tactic, but it's a trivial one for his standards. He goes knight to c4, clearing the e-file for his rook while attacking the bishop on b2. There's nothing white can do. Rook takes c4 is played. Rook e1 check. King h2. Rook takes d1. I think after rook e1 check, Wojtaszek resigned. The reason being that king h2, rook takes d1, rook takes f4, which looks like it might not be over yet. It's pretty well met by rook d2. Winning the bishop and or promoting the pawn. So, nice victory for Mr. Fabiano Caruana. The shocker, of course, being this concept with bishop takes c3 in the opening. Queen takes c3, queen f6. Don't try this at home, but it also shows how deep and rich chess still is after all these years, that this is a great idea, bishop takes c3. That at least I haven't seen in a similar position, the concept of just giving up the bishop. It's very strong. And yeah, kudos to Caruana for adding this nice idea, this nice piece of, I assume, preparation into the chess conscience. After that, he also won a nice game with a nice attack, some nice tactics. But the true shocker is bishop takes c3. In the cross table after round 9, that also means that Mr. Caruana joins the leaders, or joins Alireza Firouzja, who was the sole leader before this round. Anish Giri also won his game against Maxim Vachier-Lagrave, and they all have 6 points out of 9. While the world champion, Magnus Carlsen, managed to win his game as well, but he's 1 point behind these guys. Andrei Yesipenko and Joran van Foreest also having a good tournament. 4 rounds still to go. The fight for first should stay pretty exciting. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this game, and see you in the live commentary or in the next Game of the Day video.